Welcome to the U.S. China Global Education television series, presented by the Confucius Institute U.S. Center in partnership with the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. This 10-part series brings together presidents of universities and cultural institutions that host the Confucius Institute, along with distinguished American business, diplomatic, and educational leaders, to discuss the importance of global education, language development, and people-to-people exchange between the United States and China. My name is Tony Cully Foster, and I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Our focus is on global education, international affairs, and global communications. Like the Confucius Institute U.S. Center, we build educational bridges and advance international understanding between students, teachers, and professionals in the United States, China, and worldwide. We have a valued strategic partnership with the Confucius Institute U.S. Center. Their focus is on Chinese language development, global education, and people-to-people exchanges between the United States and China. It's my honor today to be here with my friend and colleague, Professor Gao Qing, the Executive Director of the Confucius Institute U.S. Center, who will introduce our program today.
Thank you, Tony. Today, it is our great pleasure to welcome two distinguished speakers at the National Press Club. Former U.S. Ambassador to China, Stapleton Roy, and Mr. James Heimowitz, the President of China Institute, which is the oldest bicultural organization in the U.S. devoted exclusively to China. Mr. Heimowitz was among one of the first group of American students who went to China to study in the 1980s. He went on to become a very successful leader in finance, communications, and management consulting, serving at J.P. Morgan Chase, Boston consulting firm, and Deutsche Bank. He led media strategy for the spectacular 2008 Beijing Olympics as the CEO of Hilton Norton Strategies Asia. Mr. Heimowitz received his MBA degree from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He brings his unique background and experiences to the China Institute. Now, let's join Mr. Heimowitz, who will begin this very important dialogue.
Thank you to the World Affairs Council, and thank you, Professor Gao and the Confucius Institutes here in the United States. I'm James Heimowitz here at the National Press Club, and I'm delighted to welcome career ambassador, Ambassador Stapleton Roy. He really needs no introduction, having served a very illustrious career in the Foreign Service as ambassador to China, as well as ambassador to Singapore and to Indonesia. And upon his retirement, he started the Kissinger Institute at Woodrow Wilson Institute. He's certainly a friend and an expert, having been born in China. And I'm just delighted to welcome him here today and to engage him in a conversation about his perspective, his experience, and his views. It's really important. I think that from my perspective as president of the China Institute, China and the U.S. are probably the two most important countries on this planet at this time. And I was wondering, you were born in China. How much time did you actually spend living in China?
I lived in China as a child for 10 of my first 15 years, split between 1 year, 7 years, and 2 years. Subsequently, I have lived in China for 10 more years. So altogether, I total about 20 years.
Quite a bit of time.
All parts of China, including Taiwan.
Did that experience in your early childhood influence your thinking to become a Foreign Service officer?
It certainly had some influence. Because of my experience growing up in China, I had this vague interest in doing something involved with international relations. But I didn't know very much about the field. A Foreign Service recruiting officer came to my college in the winter of my junior year, and I went and heard the talk, and it made the Foreign Service sound like a very exciting career. So I made it my first choice, The problem was that they weren't hiring people directly out of college. If you passed the written exam and made a good impression in the oral exam, they would tell you, go away, do your military service, come back in 2-3 years, and you don't have to retake the written exam, but we'll give you another oral exam, and your chances of being hired are pretty good. So I assumed that that was what was going to happen to me. So I signed up for a naval aviation program.
Okay.
So when, to my great surprise, I ended up passing the oral test for the Foreign Service, I was confronted with a choice because I got my orders to Pensacola the same day. So naturally, I consulted my draft board.
Okay.
I said, what are my chances?
I won't ask you which where they were drafting for at that time.
Well, this was 1956.
Okay.
So the draft was still very much a factor.
Part of life for
That's
young
right.
men.
And they said, well, it's about 50-50. But if you were drafted, it was 2 years. If I went into the Navy, it would be 3.5 years. So I decided, Foreign Service was offering me a job, I would take it. I'd run the risk of being drafted, because then it would only be 2 years.
Interesting. Just stepping back a second, what were your parents' hometown here in the U.S.?
Both my parents came from Pittsburgh.
From Pittsburgh. Now they went and chose to go overseas to China. I'm wondering what the neighborhood in Pittsburgh would have thought of that decision and what their perception of China was at that time.
Well, the Pittsburgh, the churches in the Pittsburgh area were very supportive of overseas missionary educational activities. My parents were educational missionaries. My father wasn't an ordained minister. He served as a teacher and a professor in Chinese university that was supported partly by contributions from churches in the United States. But the interesting aspect of it is my father was born in Laredo, Texas, and he wanted to be a missionary in Mexico. But my mother had heard a China missionary give a talk, and so she decided that China would be the better place. So they prayed for guidance, and my mother concluded that they should be missionaries in Mexico, and my father concluded that we should be missionaries in China. So they ended up going to China.
Got it. Because one of the things that I constantly face at China Institute is I think that the perceptions about China here in the United States are often not exactly very accurate about what the reality is in China. And I'm wondering if you feel that way too, and if you feel that there's misperceptions about China here in the United States.
It varies. If passions get riled up, then often it will distort the way that news is presented to the American people. At other times, our journalists are very, very high caliber people in my experience, particularly at important posts. But I had the strange experience while serving as ambassador in China of having every American who visited China in 1993 was shocked to discover the conditions in China were far better than was being reported in the U.S. media.
When you say conditions, do you mean living conditions, or?
The economy was growing, people seemed to be behaving freely. You didn't have the sense of an oppressive government weighing down on the people, which was the impression that was being pervaded in the United States. This was the period after the Tiananmen events in June of 1989, and attitudes toward China at that time were very negative in the United States.
It's interesting though, because certainly at one level, I appreciate what you're saying. At another level, I think about, at a human to human level, and I see America still as a very aspirational place for Chinese people. Aspirational for them to come and study in America, to learn about American educational system, for living here, for investing here. So in some ways, they get past that political hurdle, I might say. And in some ways, I think that living in China, Chinese understanding about America, including our political system, but also our lifestyle, may be greater than that America understands about China.
Well, there's been an enormous shift in that respect. We had a period from 1949 until really 1971 when Chinese had no exposure to the United States at all. And it was only the older people in China who'd studied in the West before the Communist Revolution succeeded that had any personal experience of the United States. So when Chinese students first began to go to the United States to study after we established diplomatic relations in 1979, they went without anybody who could prepare them for the experience of living in the United States. At that time, my judgment was that the America-China specialists had a much better understanding of China than the Chinese-American specialists had of the United States. That has changed now, because the Chinese have flooded us with hundreds of thousands of their best and brightest students. And they have not simply spent 6 months or a year in the United States. In many cases, they have lived for years, both studying in our universities and in quite a few cases working in American companies after their graduation. And many of them then go back to China, and they have the experience of long exposure to the United States. There's an interesting rule of thumb here. We discovered that when Chinese students started going to the United States, they had real culture shock problems. And they were not comfortable living in the United States because of the weird food and the fact that they had to make decisions that were made for them in China. And people are not always comfortable in being confronted with decisions when they're not used to having to make them. And it took them 2 years before they adjusted to life in the United States. And that culture shock factor no longer was a significant element. Now that tells you something, which is if it takes 2 years before you're comfortable living in a country, then short-term programs won't do the trick. You may learn, you may improve your knowledge of the language, but you haven't lived in the culture long enough to be comfortable living in that culture. And I've always felt that one of the big advantages of growing up in China was that from my earliest experiences, Chinese have been ordinary human beings just like everybody else.
Well, people are people everywhere.
Yes, but not everybody recognizes that.
And that's true. That's a challenge. You know, in my own experience learning Chinese, it gave me a tremendous insight into the way a country operates, into its culture, into everything. And it's interesting. At China Institute, we have a school for Chinese study that's been teaching Chinese for 90 years. And I listen to some of our American students, and they say, we've mastered Chinese or achieved a certain level of competence to be able to be effective, but Chinese companies are not willing to take in American students in the same way that you described that American companies welcome Chinese. You go to whether it's a financial institution or a technology industry, and I think part of the American, in the DNA is to be accepting. And we do have Chinese that have worked their way both from entry level, graduate level, and can be successful participants in the American business sphere. Do you think that that's something that's possible for an American who understands China and Chinese to be successful in a Chinese company in a similar kind of way?
It varies in every case. Chinese companies manage their businesses in ways that are not identical to the way that American businesses or European businesses handle themselves.
Because from my perspective, I believe the best way to think about a deeper understanding of China and vice versa is actually at the human-to-human level, whether it's a business student then making his way into a company, whether it's somebody in the entertainment field. Any of those things actually draw us closer together, but it's not easy, the way you just said. But I'm just curious, from your perspective as being for a diplomat for so long, at the policy level, what do you think are the most important policy initiatives we can put forward to help enable that kind of an exchange?
Well, there are many roads to Rome. And if you want to get to Rome...
or to Beijing.
Or to Beijing, you need to know something about the various alternatives. And if you want to move a lot of goods to Beijing, you might want to use all of the available roads. If you're trying to improve relations with another country, or at least improve understanding of the other country, you need to use all of the roads. And I find that educational exchanges are a superb way to increase the knowledge and ability to understand the behavior patterns of the other country. Because educational exchanges, usually you have to learn the language. That introduces you to the culture. If you have experience living in the other country, you begin to understand their behavior patterns better. And this means that you react to the other country based on the substantive nature of the behavior, instead of saying, that guy's a jerk because he's a Chinese. That is the worst type of reaction, where you attribute your inability to understand why the other person is behaving the way they do to the ethnic factor. And in most cases, that's simply not the case. Chinese fight with each other. They have personal disputes. There's no reason you can't get into a personal dispute with the Chinese. But you shouldn't blame the problem on the fact that they're Chinese. You have to separate those two things, and it helps to have lived long enough in the culture so that you understand that if you behave in certain ways, you can be accepted in the other society, with rare exceptions, because the Chinese can be prejudiced just the way everybody else is. For example, if Chinese who don't study in the United States feel that people who have studied in the United States are getting preferential treatment when they return, that creates resentment. And then you have a problem of resentment within the Chinese system between those who've studied abroad or become false foreign devils, as they call them, and those who have not had that opportunity.
Well, wouldn't you say that exists as a conflict between the elite and those that have had those experiences in any system, actually?
Yes.
So it's
but
not.
In China's case, it is more prevalent, as it is in many of the countries I've served in East Asia, because they sent more people to study in the United States than we sent to study in their countries. We had, in Thailand, we had the American Field Service would send American teenagers to live in the homes of Thai families. And they would go in without any language preparation. And they had to sort of struggle for a year to adapt to living in Thai culture. But they were terrific kids, because we used to have them into our house for Thanksgiving dinner. And they were just doing fantastic jobs of immersing themselves in the foreign culture. So it was working wonderfully from the American standpoint. But the Thai students who went to the United States, when they returned to their local villages, they could no longer integrate, because they had learned American habits of not treating elders with the respect that was required in Thai culture. And so their problem was they couldn't reintegrate into their own societies, whereas the American students didn't have any problems reintegrating into the United States after that experience.
Fascinating sort of comparison. But at the end of the day, I think we still need to forge forward and try.
Oh, absolutely.
And have those things. Because, in my view, as I started this conversation by saying that I think that China and the United States are probably the two most important countries on the planet for the next chunk of time. And in some ways we're friendly, and in some ways we learn to work with each other. But in many ways, I don't think we're good enough friends. And I think for us to sort of improve the planet, we need to become better friends at a national level. And I think the reason that we're not good enough friends is because we don't trust each other enough. And the only way that you build trust is through a deeper understanding, in my view. And that understanding, from my view, comes across by getting inside, like you said, whether it's a Thai person's respect for their elderly, or whether it's a Chinese conception of understanding what nationalism is about, or pride in history, yet looking forward. All of these things come through a deeper connection at a human-to-human level, through education, through sports, through culture, through business, as well as through the sort of political framework that our government-to-government puts in place. And I was wondering what you think from our side, from the American side, we can do in terms of a political framework for engagement that could perhaps improve that. And what would you say are the factors for success in the political framework in Sino-U.S. relations?
Well, you've touched on a very important issue, which is this question of trust. And I think that understanding can contribute to trust, but it's broader than that. The way you build trust is by doing what you have told the other side you will do. But if you tell the Chinese you're not, well, I'll give you an example. We ended up with missiles raining into the Taiwan Strait because we had told the Chinese at a high official level that the president of Taiwan, President Lee Teng-hui, would not be permitted to visit the United States. And then because of a non-binding vote in Congress, in which virtually everybody voted that he ought to be allowed to visit the United States, we reversed ourselves. And the result was the Chinese lost confidence that the United States would stick to our one China policy. And the result is they began to use threats of force against Taiwan to substitute for that.
Spiraling downwards.
Here was a catastrophic loss of trust in the United States because we reversed ourselves after providing firm assurances that we would behave in one particular way. Now that's an example of where, in my judgment, we were at fault in the way that we handled that question. But in other areas, the Chinese have felt quite confident that they can trust the United States when we have a pattern of doing what we say we will do. And the same thing applies in reverse. I've negotiated treaties in some countries, not China, where there was an understanding as to how the country would handle the particular matter, and then they went to their legislature and essentially violated the agreement. So that causes a loss of trust.
So are the two sides doing better at this now? Are they following through in a consistent way that's improving since the time that you've been there, or you feel that things are deteriorating?
I don't think quite frankly, I don't think the problem between China and the United States is a lack of trust. I prefer to put it in terms of a strategic rivalry. And the fact of the matter is that the United States has been the established superpower in the world for the entire post-Cold War period. And China has been rising more rapidly than any country has been able to do in human history. And the United States feels threatened by the fact that China's military is getting more capable.
By the way, not just the United States, I would add.
Not only the United States. I mean, China has a contradiction between the patterns of behavior that Chinese now feel they are entitled to because they're a more important country, and their diplomacy with their neighbors. Because when they behave that way, their neighbors all feel threatened. And so China has struggled with this question of what they call 周边外交, which is diplomacy with your neighbors. Because when they abandon 韬光养晦, which is keeping a low profile, which was Deng Xiaoping's advice, all of a sudden their neighbors have problems with Beijing. And that causes problems for the foreign ministry, and they have to try to deal with that problem.
This really brings up something really, really interesting to me. You talked about, the leadership role that the United States has played for the past several decades and the important role we've had on the global stage. I think pretty uniformly across America, Americans feel good about that leadership role, and there's quite a level of anxiety about ceding that to an emerging China. My question for you really is, do you think that an increasingly strong and a strong China on the global platform is actually a positive thing as a counterbalance, and there could be more voices on the global platform than just one American strong voice? Or is it something that we need to really be wary of?
I think you need to understand how strength, capabilities affect behavior. Do you remember the old Charles Atlas bodybuilding ads?
I do. Skinny on the beach.
Skinny 98-pound weakling on the beach. Along comes the big muscle man and kicks sand into his face, and his girlfriend says, "You don't do anything about it." So he takes the Charles Atlas bodybuilding course, and the next time the bully comes around, he gets his comeuppance because he's developed these big muscles himself. But the ad ends there. What about that bully? He now has the muscles necessary to go kick sand in other people's face. Did he begin to behave that way? Well, anyone who knows human nature knows that if you have 10 people like that, some of them will go around and start kicking sand in other people's faces. So there's no question that China's feeling that it needs more powerful military is because Chinese all feel that they have been the subject of abuse by stronger foreign powers who have taken advantage of China's weakness, and that China needs to be strong in order to avoid humiliating treatment by foreigners. The problem is, once they get those muscles, is China going to be able to constrain their own behavior? Or are they going to start lording it over their neighbors? And the answer is, the person who promoted the concept of peaceful rise in China didn't allow for the psychological changes that occur in China as they become a more powerful country. And in the South China Sea, for example, the Southeast Asians see China as behaving like that bully who kicks sand into other people's faces.
So that's interesting. We're talking about
Yes.
the rising power, but I don't think we would have characterized America as a bully. We would have
We
characterized...
don't, but that doesn't mean we weren't.
I see. So do you think we went through that phase too when America behaved like a bully?
I think this is a very important issue, because normally a country emerges on top because he defeats some enemy. And you have goals for the war. For example, when we defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, we had the concept of trying to set up a world order that would prevent a repetition of that type of conflict. And so we set up the United Nations, became a member of it, etc. But in the case of the Soviet Union, we didn't defeat them. They collapsed. And we were not anticipating their collapse. So all of a sudden, we ended up as the sole superpower in the world, and we had no plan for what we would do with that position. Now, what's the second part of this? What is the U.S. political concept? It was discussed at length in the Federalist Papers, and it's enshrined in our Constitution. Power corrupts, and therefore you have to check and balance power and prevent the undue accretion of power in any concentration of power in any one person. Our Bill of Rights is directed against the government. Congress shall not pass any law restricting the freedom of speech or of religion, et cetera, et cetera. If you read the Bill of Rights, the government's the threat because the government has the power. Now, why do we only apply that domestically and not internationally? And in my judgment, we made a major error in the post-Cold War period by failing to recognize that in order for us to behave responsibly as the sole superpower, we had to strengthen international institutions that would also constrain our behavior as a great power. Instead, we did the opposite. We didn't want international institutions to be able to restrain our freedom to use our power any way we wanted. We went to wars of choice in Iraq and Afghanistan and engaged in other behavior patterns because there was no other major power that was in a position to oppose us. Now that world is changing. We're moving from that post-Cold War phase where we were the sole superpower into a new world situation in which there are several major powers, such as China, which is now beginning to get the air and naval capabilities to erode our dominance in the Western Pacific. And the question is, how are we going to adapt to that type of challenge that is now emerging?
And how do we...
This is where strategic rivalry we see is built right into the challenge. And both sides recognize it. And both sides say that we need to manage this so that the cooperative aspects of the bilateral relationship are more dominant than the competitive aspects. The trouble is, we're not applying that in the military sphere. Xi Jinping says that the Pacific is large enough for both China and the United States to have major military forces. Well, that's true, but that doesn't happen automatically. You need policies that will enable the two countries to coexist with each other in the Pacific in ways that don't have our militaries constantly in challenge with each other. Can you do that? The answer is yes. It's been done in Europe. It can be done with other countries. I'll give you an example. Military strategists will tell you that you have to judge other people in terms of their capabilities, not simply their intentions. It's the capabilities you look at. Well, Let's look at 1971. At the beginning of the year, communist forces were lined up with Soviet forces in our calculation of the enemy forces that we had to deal with. But after Dr. Kissinger's visit to Beijing in July of 1971, followed by the visit of President Nixon to China, all of a sudden, Chinese forces were no longer hostile forces. Their capabilities hadn't changed one iota. But our assessment of their intentions now gave us confidence that we did not have to worry about the Chinese using their forces against us. And in fact, we lined them up on our side in terms of the forces that were prepared to cooperate in dealing with the Soviet threat. So this means that it's very important to have a relationship with Beijing that can enable China to have powerful military forces and for us to have powerful military forces in the Western Pacific without believing that those will be used in a threatening way against the other.
Very interesting.
And we're not there yet.
No, and it's a very sobering perspective that you bring up and raises quite a few challenges that I wanted to sort of probe out a little bit. You talked about the importance of engaging in international organizations.
Right.
And we talked in the beginning when you talked about the
Right.
United States. From my time in China, I would say that there's a frustration, and I would say that China sees itself as being more engaged with international organizations than it sees America being involved with international organizations. Well, I don't know if you would agree with that. I also found your characterization of leadership and bullying. You know, when we look at something and we talk about a country's capacity, that doesn't necessarily translate into the fact that their leadership will turn into bullying. And I wonder, and I think it's important as the balance of power changes on the global platform, that we remind people of the importance of international organizations, that we remind them of the importance about what leadership and bullying are, you know, on a spectrum. And that's why I come back to education and I come back to this trust factor. I personally think that trust is actually very, very important, because if you trust somebody, you're not going to feel bullied by them. You could feel, you'll allow yourself to be exposed and vulnerable because you trust them to behave in a responsible way that's going to move things forward. So I just wanted to come back.
No, I agree with that aspect of it. If you have a friendly relationship with somebody, you trust that person will not take a hostile action against you. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, we need a relationship with China, which causes us to believe that neither side has the intention to take hostile action against you.
So let me ask your own personal view. Do you feel in this case, how comfortable are you and how comfortable do you think America is with this shift and this redistribution of power on the global platform? Is this something that could be positive?
My concept of the United States is that it would be outrageous if the Americans thought that our interests required us to prevent other countries from raising the living standards of their people and developing the economic capabilities that enable them also to have more powerful militaries. So the issue for the United States should not be whether another country is getting stronger. It should be whether or not we have confidence that that country will behave responsibly.
Precisely,
And the
that's
goal
the trust.
of our policy should be responsible behavior,
Mm-hmm.
not trying to deny other people the larger economies, the higher standards of living that intrinsically support more powerful military forces, and which are relevant because you need more capabilities to defend yourself if you have more to defend. So we need to link those two factors together. And we're not doing that sufficiently in our view of China. And in my judgment, China's not doing it sufficiently. Let's talk about some of the areas now.
Okay.
The Americans see China as rising.
Well, it is rising.
It is rising, that's right. But we see China as wanting to dominate East Asia and perhaps even drive us out of East Asia. And you can encounter that type of thinking widespread in the U.S. government community. The Chinese see the United States as trying to contain China, ignoring the fact that we have over $600 billion of annual trade with China, which is over 100 times greater than the maximum bilateral trade we had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Now, is there any conceivable intelligent containment strategy that would permit you to have $600 billion of bilateral trade with this so-called country you're trying to contain? It's absurd. And yet you will find that probably well up into the 90% factors of Chinese believe that the United States has a containment policy against China. It makes no sense.
Well, the containment...
And they see us trying to limit Chinese influence. Well, now maybe there is a competition between the United States and China for influence, but that's not the same thing as a containment strategy. So we have misperceptions on both sides. And the question is, how do we get at the roots of those misperceptions so that we can strengthen the cooperative aspects of the relationship while not denying the existence of rivalry?
That's a really important point, actually. I'd love to thresh out with you a little what those misperceptions are and how do you think we get to the root cause? How do we overcome this? Because otherwise we come to this cycle, which is not a healthy cycle. The cycle sort of says, China's rising, America wants to contain, Chinese become dissatisfied with that, there's retribution. This is all not a very promising cycle. And I know that you'd like to be an optimist, and I know that you'd like to see the relations develop in a different kind of way. So what are the root causes, and what can we do actually to see that they get addressed in a more positive way?
Well, you raised a very interesting question. You know, the last American president that we had with a significant foreign policy background was George Herbert Walker Bush.
I thought you were going to say George Washington. So.
No.
Okay.
No. You could argue that President Nixon also had some
Yes.
background. He'd been vice president for 8 years under President Eisenhower.
And I think China views him as
That's
an
right.
important force.
But the first President Bush had been our UN representative and had been our head of our liaison office in China.
In the 70s, yep.
He had been head of the CIA. He was very comfortable with international relationships.
Okay.
But when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended, we have elected 4 American presidents in a row with no background in foreign affairs or in national security affairs. So here you have the most powerful country in the world that is electing presidents who have no background in how to use and structure the use of their power for what you would call responsible goals.
But the president sets the tone at a national level, but certainly there are subnational dialogues going on, and certainly there are other means that are, not, tied just to the White House.
When I go into an embassy now, I know how to set the tone. But if you put me in charge of General Electric or ExxonMobil, I might not know how to set the tone in that particular company because the cultural factors of the organization are different from what I'm used to. And that's our problem. We have had a series of presidents who have not been able to provide the top-down guidance on what our strategy should be in dealing with the outside world. In fact, most of them have gone around with the concept that being the sole superpower is good. And I argue that being the sole superpower is contrary to fundamental American political concepts.
Interesting.
If a president will abuse power if it's not checked and balanced, a sole superpower will abuse the power if it's not checked and balanced. And part of that checking and balancing needs to be through international organizations that apply to everybody, the strong and the weak. And that's what they're designed for.
So now what are we, 7 months into a new administration? Do you see that view any different? Do you see
No.
similar?
I think we've continued the process. We've elected a president who lacks foreign affairs experience, has no national security experience.
So if it's not going to happen emanating from the White House, what do we need to do to fill that vacuum?
You need to have people around the president who can give him good advice. Now here is where, in assessing the Trump administration, you see some positive and some negative aspects. We have a Secretary of Defense who is a highly respected general and who clearly is familiar with military affairs, but does not have extensive experience in the Washington political aspects of defense policy. You have a national security advisor who is a general and clearly understands military concepts and has a very excellent reputation. you have in the State Department Rex Tillerson, who has headed our biggest and highly respected major energy company, ExxonMobil, who has extensive experience dealing with foreign leaders, but has very little background in terms of foreign policy issues. So that these people are considered sober. They are considered people who will give the president good advice when he needs it, but are struggling with different aspects of dealing with the Washington environment, which includes the political component of dealing with Congress and all the competing forces that exist in Washington. And they are not terribly experienced in that way. And the pace of filling the key positions in the Trump administration has moved more slowly than at any time since World War II.
Which brings me back to something, you know, I fully understand and appreciate what you've just said, but from my perspective, leading sort of a nonprofit organization, my own view is, you know, government at the end of the day needs to represent its people, and it needs to actually fulfill against the aspirations of the people that, you know, put that government and empower that government. So my answer to you in this response would be, when I see a vacuum in the White House or in the government, I want to come back and build those civil organizations. In the case of China and the U.S., my own experience is that the business community, for example, was probably 5 to maybe 10 years ahead of where the government was in forging more powerful and constructive engagement between China and the United States. And the business community were actually more effective ambassadors in achieving, I would say, not diplomatic, but in the relationship as a whole. Now, I see rising the importance of all these civil organizations. We have a school, we have a gallery, we have a center for business. So we take that pillar for business. I think that will go on. I think the business motivation that business people have engaging back and forth with China will continue, and will continue to be a basis for, you know, connectivity and for a positive relationship. I see things coming across, you know, whether it's educational, whether it's cultural, whether it's civil organizations. And for me, these are the institutions that need to step up in a time when the White House and the government may be lacking that direct experience. And for me, that's why it's so important, I think, to see these exchanges that you mentioned earlier, to carry on, to see the business flow going back and forth, to encourage American corporations, academic institutions, cultural institutions to be welcome to international voices, Chinese, including Chinese. And I would encourage China to think more about increasing access inside Chinese companies to American students who have studied business in Chinese, to Chinese universities are moving in that direction, whether it's at Tsinghua University or Beida. Some of the more international approach that they're trying to do to integrate, I think, is a great start. I'd like to see it at cultural organizations. So for me, government may actually follow as opposed to lead what people to people want to see in the relationship.
Well, I think these people-to-people organizations that you're talking about, these non-governmental organizations, they are an important part of the balancing factors in our society that help us to decide in what direction we want to move. But there's a problem that, in my judgment, Americans are very poor at understanding, which is that democracies by their nature are not fair. They reflect the interests of their people. And if their people consists of Irish people and Germans, they are going to be more sensitive to Irish issues and to German issues than they are to the other interests. I was ambassador in Beijing at a time when human rights in China was a very hot political issue in Washington. It got constant attention. The Assistant Secretary for Human Rights was on my doorstep half the time. In the meantime, 1 million Rwandans were being murdered. And the United States, including our human rights organizations, paid no attention. Now, why is that? Is that because we really don't care about human rights? Or is it because there was no human rights constituency in our democracy to look after what was going on in Rwanda?
And a disproportionate response, I think, to the reality.
Well, no. See, here's where our government fell down. Because given the fact that democracies have constituency pressures that are not equal and balanced, they reflect particular interests. Mm-hmm. It's the role of governance to try to ease out those inequalities and ensure that our approach to human rights is reasonably consistent throughout the world. We don't do that. In fact, we don't even think this way about it. So we don't understand the forces that direct our concerns about human rights. We care about human rights in some cases, and in other cases we completely ignore them. And this outrages me. We also don't understand why human rights are violated. For example, we connected human rights conditions in China to our trade relationship with China during the period when I was ambassador, and I had to defend this to the Chinese government.
Do you think they understood the American side? They understood your defense?
Yes, I do. But I encountered two problems. One was we were asking for fundamental improvements in 7 different areas of human rights in 1 year. Now, how long did it take us to deal with slavery? 2.5 centuries, we still have problems. When we got upset by 9/11, the government that instructed me to go into the Chinese and tell them you can't use torture, you can't hide prisoners from the International Committee of the Red Cross, you can't deny habeas corpus, you have to do all these things. All of a sudden, my government was openly justifying the very human rights abuses that I had been instructed as an ambassador in China to tell the Chinese that they should do away with. The second aspect that is instructional is I could get no guidance from Washington. My approach was, okay, Washington wants us to make progress, fundamental progress in these 7 different areas of human rights. Let's see if we can make some progress in all 7 of them. And then we'll have an argument with Washington over whether we can call that fundamental progress or not fundamental progress. But if you want to negotiate something, you have to be able to tell the other side that if you do this, we will do this. Zero guidance. Why? Because there was a battle in Washington between those who were opposed to the linkage in the first place and the human rights people who didn't care what China did. They wanted to keep the linkage because that enhanced their power within the U.S. government. The result was, I have 1 year to try to get progress on these human rights issues and have a Washington that is incapable of sending me instructions what we will do if the Chinese do what we are asking them to do.
So this comes back to, functionality and dysfunctionality, but it also speaks to...
This is why I say that human rights issues are too important to be left to the human rights groups.
But I would also say that the bilateral relations between China and the U.S. are too important to focus on one important issue.
Of course.
And human rights, as we have spoken about it, no doubt is an important concept for America, and it's an important concept for how we relate to China, but it's only one important concept. And we've just spent this amount of time, and I wonder if we think that that has dominated in a way disproportionately, because we know that that's going to be a difficult area.
No, but there's a reason why we behave this way. And I think we're perhaps not reflective enough of it. We were a country formed on the basis of high ideals. But from the very beginning, we had to make a compromise. That was an evil compromise. In order to get unity, we had to accept slavery as an institution, and it was written into our Constitution. And we knew it was wrong. And we tried to deal with that problem for 70 years after we established our the United States of America. Failed. We fought a bloody civil war trying to deal with the problem. We eliminated the institution of slavery, and then we reinstituted Jim Crow treatment of our black population in the South and elsewhere. It wasn't just in the South. And it wasn't until the civil rights legislation of the 1960s that we began to make significant progress in dealing with this. In other words, it took us not just decades, but centuries trying to struggle with these types of problems.
Yep.
But that's why we are activists on human rights issues. Because from the very beginning of our republic, we were struggling with the human rights abuses in the United States that were embedded in our very system, and that made us activists. Women didn't get to vote without 60 years of agitation by suffragettes. Men simply were not prepared to recognize that women were equal human beings with the males. That took struggle. So I have never been embarrassed by the fact that the United States, in contrast to other countries, has been more active in standing up for human rights issues. But we have to be fair in our approach, and we have to understand why we behave the way we do. Otherwise, we can't explain it effectively to others.
And you know what, Stape? My feeling about this is I wish more of China understood why this is a sensitive issue to America. I also wish that more Americans would understand why stability is so sensitive in China. And I think that's where the communication comes. We'd be in a lot smoother place if your people in China, the man in the street, the government official, understood, just like you said, our history and our DNA. This makes us sensitized to this. Similarly, what looks like strong-handed government in China is actually appreciated in many regards because Chinese want a stable government. You know, we need to understand that if I look back, China Institute's been around 90 years. It went through warlords, it went through liberations in China, it went through Cold Wars, it went through cultural revolutions, and most of contemporary China doesn't want to relive the past 100 years of Chinese history. So I think it's two ways. And every time we come back with this Americans' view of China strong-handed, it's because I think part of the reason is that's a particular sensitivity.
Well, here's where education becomes important.
There you go.
Because education should enable educated Americans to better understand these questions. And I feel that we are not doing an adequate job in this respect. China is facing a different problem in my judgment. They have been unbelievably successful in modernizing the country in a very short period of time.
Everything from infrastructure to systems
the
to
ruling
health.
system. 25 years ago, the Politburo of the Communist Party didn't have any college graduates on the Politburo. Now virtually all of them have college educations. Mm-hmm. Name another country in the world in which you've had such a radical change in the educational qualifications of the top strata of the political leadership. I mean, it's a really remarkable change.
You know, it's interesting you say that, Stape, because my own impression, having lived in China for long periods of time, is that the government is changing. Now, is it having a structural change, you know, in terms of the way that the Chinese system is put up? Maybe not, but government is changing, and my life living in Beijing changed along with the changing government.
Right.
In everything in terms of my daily life, for registering with local police, for how the judicial, you know, how the the judicial system works, about interacting with the officialdom at every level, from public security to immigration. So my view is that it is dynamic and that it is changing. Maybe not at the systemic level that you talk about, but within the system, it's still changing.
You've made a very important point. And here again, this is an area where, in my judgment, our educational system is not adequately educating Americans on these types of factors. What most people care about when we talk about politics is not the sort of theoretical issues that we have just been debating. Mm-hmm. It's a question of whether the government is on your back or off your back.
Or got your back.
During the 1960s, the government was on the back of everybody in China.
Yep.
You had no freedom in selecting where you worked, where you went to school, where you could travel, where you could leave the country, et cetera, et cetera. You couldn't move from one city to another because it was controlled, et cetera. All of that has changed.
It has.
So government has gotten off the backs of the Chinese people to a large degree, but not for those segments of the population who want to call openly for political change.
But isn't that
and the
political
government
change?
is on the backs of those people. Now, this is in accord with your view that there has been significant political change in China, and I agree with that. But the change has not occurred at the systemic level that reflects the fact that as the society of China changes through the success of the reform and openness policies, there has to be change from what I call a pre-modern form of governance in China. Pre-modern forms of government place power above the law. Mm-hmm. And essentially, it's the old monarchical system where power is concentrated in the hands of rulers who don't have checks and balances on how they can use the power. And you can't make a modern society and keep a pre-modern form of governance. So the systemic changes have to occur. But we Americans can't say what they ought to be. We can't say when the change should occur, but you can
Or how it should look.
But you can predict with confidence that unless top leaders in China recognize the need for that systemic adaptation, they're ultimately going to lose control of the process.
Fascinating. I just want to say, for the past hour, having this discussion has been really fascinating to me. And it drives home one other thing to me. It drives home somebody as knowledgeable as yourself, somebody who's spent so much time deeply thinking about, experiencing and thinking about issues that impact China, impact the United States, and impact our relations. And still, the faces and the challenges that we face. And for me, I don't actually necessarily agree with the exact content of what you said, but I think fundamentally I agree with the fact that China's changing, America's changing, our place on the global platform is changing. And no matter what, China and the United States are going to probably be, as I said in the beginning, the two most important countries to occupy this planet.
Most of the changes are for the better in China. I mean, I lived in China when it was poor, impoverished, and abused. And China now has a far higher standard of living, a far higher educational level, and its growth, unlike that of the Soviet Union, is contributing to the economic well-being of the countries around it.
And hopefully...
So there's no reason why we should be upset about the fact that China is growing rapidly if we have the wit and wisdom to know how to deal with a rapidly rising country in terms of recognizing the legitimate rights and at the same time behaving in a way that encourages responsible behavior by a new and more powerful China.
Absolutely. And on both sides, I think, having a deeper appreciation and understanding and comfort level with this changing dynamic. Because if we don't, it's going to spiral in a very bad way.
We are very good when we choose to be good. Unfortunately, we don't always choose to be good.
And I have every hope and expectation that the Chinese side will rise to the occasion and match us and behave similarly.
The best way to get other people to do what you want
Lead
is
by
to set
example.
a good example.
So, Ambassador Roy, I just wanted to take this opportunity to again express my gratitude to you, to our friends at the World Affairs Council and at the Confucius Institute of America for making this available to us and for bringing this opportunity to life. It's been very enlightening. I've enjoyed this discussion thoroughly, and thank you again.